weeks there was one victory celebration after another. The prince forgot how quickly time was passing until the white cat said, "As much as it saddens me to go, the time has come for you to return to your father. Take this walnut, but do not break it open until you are in his presence. It will satisfy his wish." "My beloved cat, I would rather stay here with you." But the white cat shook her head sadly, so the prince kissed her paw and said goodbye. This time, the prince was the last of the brothers to return home. When he returned to the throne room, each of his brothers had already produced linen of such fine quality that the king could not decide between them. The youngest son held up the walnut and cracked it. However, inside a piece of linen, he found a hazelnut inside. He cracked the hazelnut and found a cherry pit. His brothers looked at each other and smiled. The king chuckled to himself. The prince grew very red, but he proceeded to break the cherry pit. Inside, he found a grain of wheat. His brothers laughed and made fun of him. The prince ignored them and confidently opened the kernel of wheat. Inside was a single tiny mustard seed. He looked at it and thought, "White cat, have you played a joke on me?" At that moment, he heard a familiar voice, a whisper that only he could hear. "Have you so little faith in your friend?" it said. Ashamed of his doubts, the prince opened the mustard seed, and, to the amazement of all, drew out a piece of linen 400 yards long, on which were painted all kinds of birds, animals, and fish, as well as trees, shrubs, fruit, and the sun, moon, and stars. There were portraits of all the reigning kings and queens of the world. In one corner was a picture of the white cat herself. The cloth was passed 3 times through the eye of the thinnest needle, before the king could proclaim his son the winner. The 2 elder sons complained that the contest had not been won fairly. The fate of the kingdom should not be decided by a piece of cloth, they said. The king drew a long sigh. Then he said, "Go travel for yet another year. Whichever you brings me home the most beautiful young lady shall marry her and be crowned king. But mark my words, this time my decision will be final." Though the youngest prince felt cheated twice over, he was too respectful to his father to complain. He set out once on the long, familiar road back to his beloved white cat. When he arrived at the castle, he was escorted to a high tower. The white cat was watching the sky through a tall window. She greeted him warmly, but there was sadness in her voice. "What troubles you, my dear friend?" he asked. "Today the wizard dwarf, Minot, arrives to ask for my hand in marriage. He gave me 5 years to agree. When he finds that I will not marry him, he will destroy me." "Why don't you fight him with your troops?" "He has cast a spell over this land and all who live here. We cannot fight him. But my heart remains my own. I would rather die than marry him." "Then I will challenge him for you," cried the prince. "No, I beg you, he is too powerful." But the prince would not listen. Seeing she could not change his mind, the white cat gave him the bracelet she always wore. From it dangled a silver cat's paw with tiny diamond claws. "Take this," she said. "It is my own good luck charm. Perhaps it will protect you from Minot's spells." Since the bracelet was too small to fit his wrist, the prince hung it from a chain around his neck so it would be near his heart. Suddenly, the white cat cried, "He is coming!" The prince looked where she had pointed. Charging through the air was a chariot drawn by winged salamanders. Goblins mounted on ostriches rode alongside. In the chariot sat the wizard. He was very short, with bird's claws for hands and feet. His head was enormous, and his red nose was so big and thick, a dozen crows could have perched on it. The white cat and the prince ran from the tower, and shouted for the guards to secure the palace. Invisible hands quickly sealed the doors and windows. Suddenly, Minot's chariot burst through the great doors of the main hall. The prince drew his sword. At a signal from the dwarf wizard, the salamander sent a burst of flame at the young man. But the prince was not harmed. The charm the white cat had given him kept him safe from the salamander's fire. The prince rushed forward and lopped off the monster's head as it lunged towards him. The fire died away. The wizard leaped to the ground in a rage. He raised his wand, but the prince sliced it in 2 with one stroke of his sword. Minot transformed himself into an enormous 2-headed rock. The prince and the 2-headed rock fought back and forth along the length of the hall. The creature's wings swept the hangings from the walls, and the crystal chandeliers crashed to the floor. All the while, the white cat and her servants could do no more than watch. Suddenly, the white cat shouted, Cut between the heads. That may be his way to kill him. The prince summoned all his strength, raised his sword, and sliced the heads apart with a bird-like screech from one end and an almost human cry of despair from the other. The creature collapsed. The prince turned to the white cat, but she had vanished. Where she had stood a moment before lay only a piece of rock crystal the size of a man's fist. Her servants had disappeared, and so had the magical hands. Afraid that by slaying the wizard, he'd also destroyed his beloved friend and her courtiers, the prince cried, "My beloved white cat, where have you gone?" A ghostly sweet voice whispered back, "You will never see the white cat again, but take the crystal and present it to your father." Sorrowfully, the prince returned home. When he arrived, his two brothers were already there, with two very lovely young ladies. They asked the young prince what his lady was like. He replied that he had brought only a crystal of rare beauty, which he hoped might please their father. The king welcomed his elder sons and their ladies. Again, he could not decide which son should have the prize. Then his youngest son bowed and presented the crystal to him. The king reached out for it, but as he did, it fell from the prince's hand and shattered. There was a sudden blaze of brilliant light, and then a lovely woman appeared before them. She had golden hair and wore a white silk gown decorated with embroidered cats. The king cried, "She has won the beauty of my crown for my youngest son." The woman said to the prince, "Under the wizard's spell, I was the white cat. You have freed me and all the people of my land." To the king she said, "As queen, I offer my own lands to be divided between your elder sons. In return, I ask for your friendship and for your youngest son to be my husband." The king bowed gracefully to her and granted her request. The marriages of all three brothers were celebrated at once with great joy. The old king retired to the country, and the three brothers set about ruling their kingdoms. From that time on, the queen, who had once been the white cat, became renowned for her knowledge, her courage, her beauty, and her generous heart. The end.